everyone, and welcome to the Dorky Dunkleosteus. I'm your curator, Carla, and today's episode is going to be on geomythology. So, what is geomythology? This is a fairly new study of geological and paleontological discoveries by ancient people. This was first defined by Dorothy Vitaliano in 1968. She was a wonderful woman. She was at the University of Indiana, I believe. She actually coined the term and was kind of a forerunner and a forefather of, or a foremother rather, of the study of geomythology. So this looks at mythology and these kind of cultural stories with a scientific eye. So that looks at myths and monsters, and geomythologists actually turn myths and monsters into real events and creatures by looking at these events and these stories, these creation stories, these mythologies that are all around the globe from native and first people, and we correlate them to potential geological discoveries and paleontological discoveries, basically looking at what they may have interacted with, or what their ancestors, rather, would have interacted with. Adrienne is a leading voice in geomythology. She has 2 books. The first, which I highly recommend, is Myth and Monsters in Ancient Greek and Roman Times. And it is an awesome introduction to the topic, and it's really quite engaging. She goes through and actually, in great detail, discusses some of the things that we're going to be discussing right now. So what kind of myths and monsters do geomythologists look at? Well, a lot of them. So Griffin, Cyclops, Devil's Tower, Sodom and Gomorrah, Falling Stars, Fighting Gods. Any of these stories which have a reoccurring storytelling, which have very distinct either references to actual places now on the map, or have exact locations in the stories, or that have very, very specific descriptions in their storytelling. This can be really difficult, actually, because... Oh, excuse me. Late night recording again. This can be really difficult, though, because a lot of these stories are actually kept close to the breast of these native people and these First Nations, because traditionally, Caucasian European colonialism and imperialism has actually erased these people. So much so that their belief systems and their stories, their knowledge has been completely disregarded even today in museums and certain institutions and cultural institutions. And that's not right. And I know there are a lot of museum professionals, myself included, who want to see that changed. We want to see it include First Nations. We want to actually examine and treat their culture with the respect that it absolutely deserves, just as much as, Greek and Roman and Egyptian. Okay, maybe they're not treated with as much respect. Again, going back to that colonialism and that imperialism from Euro-Caucasian Americans and Euro-Caucasian individuals and societies. But the fact is, we can change that. We can actually interact with these people and hopefully rebuild the bridges. Not all of them, because some of these societies have become so erased that they no longer know the stories, which is really quite sad. One of the groups of people who do actually still have these stories and still tells these stories, at least very, I should say famously, but a lot of people know about, is the Aboriginal people of Australia. And they are very, very tight-lipped about what they tell outsiders, but they also have very, very strict influences. So they do not let storytellers embellish. It's very strict, and that's actually why the stories that come from the Aboriginal people of Australia, New Zealand, and the Maori, and these people is considered some of them being first-hand accounts. They're very, very credible. Historians and anthropologists do actually give a lot of credit to these stories, but this wasn't always it. So let's take a look at some of the stories. Let's start off with the griffin and the cyclops. So the origin of the griffin story actually comes from the Mongolian desert and the Iberian desert, I believe. Basically, these nomadic gold hunters, Scythians, they interacted with the ancient Greeks and in Turkey, and they would tell stories of these gold guarding creatures that they would go into the mountains and into the deserts where it's very rocky, and they would find gold in these in these nests. They didn't know they were ancient, and they would sometimes find bodies of these animals, and this was absolutely terrifying. They were so well preserved. We now know them to be actually protoceratops. They match up geologically and with the area. They match paleontologically. When you look at the skull, like I have here, I have a Greek depiction of a griffin with a skull to the right of the image that shows a protoceratops skull. And we can actually see where they got this lion-eagle hybrid. And especially with those very strange wings that are very stiff and they come kind of from the shoulder blades. When you actually look at the shoulder blade of a protoceratops or a ceratopsian species, the shoulder blade itself is very, very long and narrow. And during decomposition of the body, and sometimes these bodies actually preserve fantastically. We have complete growth series on protoceratops, but the shoulder blades would actually come up and out above the spinal column, giving it a root-like base for an attachment like a wing. Sometimes they would break off, and these Scythian gold hunters would then theorize that these things had to have flown, or at least had these weird sort of wing-like protrusions. And of course they had these nasty-looking claws, because they did have claws. They had 5 fingers, and these depictions are very specific, and when you look at the fossil records of that area, you see protoceratops. You'd find their nests. This is one of the areas in the world where these are fully articulated skeletons. They are exactly like they were like you would just had found them completely stripped of flesh. That's what they believed they were, and I can understand that. These things were absolutely amazing to stumble across, and they did. They discovered them very, very commonly, and they attributed any missing people or deaths to these griffins guarding the gold. And of course the gold would come from higher up on the mountain, and it would erode away, and it would catch in areas specifically like the depressions where they would lay their eggs, which have now become fossilized, and they would find the eggs and the gold. So they would believe, oh my god, these animals collect the gold and they lay their eggs, and they have their eggs and the gold at the same time. So they would also develop behaviors just from these fossils. And this is like they were interacting with real creatures. They believed they were real creatures, and they were, but they just weren't alive anymore. So, and they only knew of lions and eagles, so they combined these two animals, looked at these skulls and these fragments, and said, this face, it's got the body of a lion, it's shaped like a lion, and they can be very large. It must be a lion, but then they've got this beak that's like a bird, and these talons like an eagle. It's a mix. So it's really, really cool, and this is scientifically, I would say this is probably one of the best explanations for the griffin. Now, the Cyclops is a very famous mythology from ancient Greece. And, of course, we all know Odysseus. His travels, he ran across the Cyclops. And here we actually have, on the left-hand side, we actually have a sculpture depicting a Cyclops. And that strange single eye in between of two brow ridges. Now, the ancient Greeks had a lot of development in their mythology. Cyclops were children of Poseidon, and they were monstrous creatures, and they were considered to be very stupid. In the mythologies and the retellings, they would easily get tricked by a smart man like Odysseus. Um, Now, Adrienne Mayer actually examined this myth as well as the Griffins, and it actually matches up that the fossil beds would have had pygmy mammoths and or mastodons. I'm not too sure which, but here's a mammoth skull. It's with the tusks, but a lot of people don't understand how easily those tusks will slide out of the sockets. And ancient Greeks would actually use ivory as tools. So they would more often or not find the ivory first and believe it was an elephant or not really an elephant. They had never interacted with elephants, so they had no idea what they were getting. It was a type of stone, they believed, and they would use that for as precious tools and ornamentation. And then after a while, sometimes these skulls would just erode out of the ground, and they had no idea what these skulls were. And when you look head on at a mastodon or a mammoth, pygmy or not, and you see that large central nasal opening, it is very, very easy to imagine that is where its eye is. Because when the Greeks looked at human skulls, the Greeks were very advanced in medicine. The Greek and the Romans, they were very, very highly advanced. And they knew of science or alchemy and this, and they would examine the human body. They would examine the bones. And when you take away the tusks, and sometimes that lower portion of the sockets would break away as well. And all you would have is this very round, very similar looking skull to a human. The other thing that's very, very similar to to humans that would contribute to Cyclops is the femur of mastodons and mammoths. They're proportionally very similar to the human femur. In fact, that is one of the other beliefs, that there were giants, is finding these mastodon and mammoth femurs, which generally preserve very well. They're a larger bone. They're generally a tougher bone, and they preserve well. Most mammoth and mastodon bones, at least where I'm from, they're preserved. They're not fossilized, but sometimes they can be fossilized. And they would see these bones and realize, oh my god, this is exactly like a human femur. Because again, remember, these people were scientific. They had advanced culture and advanced understanding of the world around them. And when I say that, I mean advanced as in comparable to today's sciences. I don't mean to say they were hyper intelligent or anything like that, or to put them on a pedestal above some of the other stories we'll examine, but rather that they had an understanding of human anatomy to the point where they compared human anatomy to any other bones that they would discover. Now again, you have to remember, the ancient Greeks had never seen an elephant. There are rumors, though, and there are some stories where they would describe the Amazonians and the battle that they would ride in on these great war beasts, and these war beasts actually matched the elephant, the Asian elephant, which of course that was discovered. There was a large battlefield in which there was Asian elephants discovered, and lots of skulls, or a relative of the Asian elephant. And they interacted with these things. They interacted with them. They discovered them. They discovered hero bones. They discovered, grand things that they couldn't exactly explain, but that they believed belonged to their gods and goddesses and great heroes of the past that they shared. So that's two of the really cool examples. Now, the wrath of gods and spirits. So coming more towards the Americas, we have, and more towards biblical examples, we have Devil's Tower, which is in Utah, in the United States. The First Nation, I can't remember the exact nation, but they have a story in which they tell that their people were fleeing from this giant bear that had ravaged their people, and they pleaded to the Great Spirit to help them escape. The Great Spirit uprooted a large tower and they lived on top of it, and their ancestors were on top of it, and they were safe from this giant bear. And the bear scratched long grooves with its massive claws into the rock, and that is the story that they have for Devil's Tower. Now today, geologists, we understand this to be actually columnar basalt, which is from the neck of a volcano. It's a dead volcano. But again, these people interacted with bears on a regular basis. Looking from a distance, it does look like massive claw marks. These people also, they had to figure out a way to explain what they didn't completely understand. This made sense. And now there's not so much in the way of proving that it was a giant bear or anything, but it's their explanation of what Devil's Tower was. So heading into the Middle East and going with a biblical story, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. They were two very sinful cities, and was it David? I think it was David. Anyway, one of the kings of the Israelites went and was trying to take over the cities, and God had seen how sinful they were and warned some people to say, get out of the city, and he smote the cities with fire and brimstone. And for a long time, this was a biblical allegory, and nobody was really sure. Well, come to find out, we actually do have references for the location of Sodom and Gomorrah. We actually know where they are, or at least an estimate of where they were. And when archaeologists and geologists took a look at the area, they found traces of uridium. Uridium being, of course, an asteroid, a non-Earth metal, a very, very rare Earth metal, rather, that generally only comes from asteroids. And they theorized that this had to have happened, and what would, coming from the sky in fire and brimstone, a asteroid or a meteorite. And of course, it wouldn't leave a crater if it exploded in the mid-atmosphere. This happened before, or rather, this would happen again, and actually again, over time. In the Tunguska event in Russia, I believe in the 1900s, early 1900s, it devastated a large swath of Siberia. And the trees were all felled, and there was a great green sky that actually was seen from Siberia all the way into Europe. And an investigator went, and they believed that it was, in fact, an asteroid that had come down and hit, but it made this weird pattern. Scientists now know that they've done experiments in small scale, and they triggered an explosion in the asteroid or meteorite, and had it explode in the mid-atmosphere, and that created that butterfly-like pattern of felling trees. This happened again in modern times in the early 2000s? Oh my gosh, was it I think it was 2016. Another meteorite exploded over Russia. And this time we actually got it on camera. There's a whole bunch of dash cam videos of this meteorite suddenly exploding. And again, it's amazing. If you didn't know about asteroids or the physics of it or whatnot, you would think, oh my God, God is smiting some people tonight. So it's completely understandable. And that would cause such massive devastation that it would leave an impression, and it would leave such a warning that, of course, we have to examine these stories from the Bible with a critical eye. We have to examine all stories like this, all mythologies, with a very critical eye to decide, okay, what can we take as far more reliable than not? Finally, the Crater Lake, another First Nation story here in the United States. This time, it is a massive crater lake, and the First Nation people actually tell the story of these two gods that had decided to go to war. There was the god of the underworld, or the below, and the god of the above. Now, the god of the the above, finally, after several hours of throwing, they describe it as fireballs and horrendous, lightning strikes and everything to the god of the below. Finally, the god of the below was smote down into back to the below world, and a giant, another giant rock was placed on top. And as you can see in this third picture on the far right, you can see that it does look like there is a giant rock, and of course that's Crater Island, in this caldera. And that's exactly what it is. It's actually a empty caldera of this mountain that had actually erupted. And when scientists, again, took that story that people had dismissed as fantasy and just savagery of people trying to explain what they're trying to see, and it's like, well, yeah, of course they're trying to understand what they're trying to see. I mean, come fucking on, people. They actually examined it and took those examinations and realized, oh my god, they are describing with exact or very fine detail an eruption, a volcanic eruption from several hundred miles away. And when they actually went there had been discovered First Nation artifacts in an ash layer, and they dated it, and they dated that, and then they asked the First Nation how many generations or how long ago did this happen. They actually have a corresponding date range that matches. And this gives so much credence to many other Native American or First Nation stories that many people have brushed off. I mean, Thunderbirds is one of my favorite stories. I actually live near Lake Ontario, and there's a story of a lake monster. There's generally, you go anywhere, if there's a big body of water, you're gonna have a lake monster story. This lake monster in Lake Ontario is actually a story of a fire dragon that comes up and shoots fireballs into the sky and then dives back into the water, and with light, and it to me it sounds more like comets or shooting stars or something like that. And of course, Lake Ontario, on a bad day, you can't see the other side at the widest part. It does seem incredibly endless, so of course it would dive into the water because the water is beyond the horizon, is in the water. So these stories are so incredible and absolutely amazing to read about and look at. So what does this all mean? Again, we should look at First Nation stories, Aboriginal stories, these cultural stories from centuries more closely. Just recently, there was seeing that, hey, we actually know that the Aboriginal people of Australia actually did interact with giant kangaroos and giant monitors. We freaking knew that already if you actually listened to them, because their stories, as I said before, the Aboriginal people of Australia have a very strict storytelling system in that you quote them verbatim. You tell the story exactly as it was told to you and exactly as it was told to your storyteller for generations. Geologically speaking, in the geologic timescale, Megalania and the giant short-faced kangaroo actually lived in Australia at the same time that the first human species was coming to Australia about 50,000 years ago. There was an overlap there, so much to the point that there was some thinking that they possibly could have caused the extinction of these creatures. That is actually now decided that there was a bit of a greenhouse effect and a global transition period in the weather and the climate that ended up knocking out these giant megafauna in Australia. But again, the Aboriginal people told us. The Aborigines told us all of this. Not that the Europeans listened, not that the Caucasian people listened, because they were savages and, unenlightened and all this kind of bullshit. So we have to look at other stories too. I mean, what about dragons? Every single culture has a dragon story. Well, what do we find a lot of? We find giant shark teeth. We find dinosaur teeth. Hey, maybe it's carnivorous dinosaurs. Especially in China, um, they, refer to them as dragons. In fact, many species of dinosaur is named with the suffix long, and long means dragon. And so this is, it boggles the mind that we're not examining these stories. Of course, we now know um, those were most likely true, and discovering of partial dinosaur remains of carnivorous dinosaurs. And how about the trolls of Southeast Asia? Um, that is Chalicotherium, which is a bane of my existence in Ark Survival Evolved because they're nasty little assholes, giant assholes, but they look and match the description of Southeast Asian mythology of giant forest trolls that walk up with their knuckles and, are hairy. Um, Now, is it possible that, this species of animal actually ended up being extinct for far longer than, at least we know, humans were around? But for some reason that story remains. Is it possible that for some time this mega mammal was actually around long enough to impress upon the ancestors of the native Southeast Asians to have this as a mythology of the troll? Absolutely. Going to Scandinavia, that's another story, but there's stories that we need to examine. And it opens up a lot more truth to these stories. Every myth has something that has triggered it that is true. Every myth has a golden nugget of truth. This is why I love geomythology. This is absolutely fascinating research. And it's not just something that can be done, for scientific, just for science or anything. You can actually use geomythology to integrate an entire museum culturally and all of the other sciences just coming together. And it's something that fascinates me, and I've always had a passion for dragons. As I've said before, dragons are something that exist in every single known culture, and they're all fairly similar in description and behavior. Now, there's a lot of things that could happen. I don't know everything. There could have been an actual, honest to God, fire-breathing dragon one time, or flying dragon. Who the fuck knows? We really don't, because we don't have any records, fossil records. We don't have anything concrete. And that, unfortunately, is how our society works, is we want concrete evidence. Well, what about just thinking about it? What about just examining the stories that our ancestors have told us, our fairy tales, our legends? This has to have come from somewhere. And it's absolutely fascinating. So here are my sources. There is the first fossil hunters, dinosaurs, mammoths, and myth in Greek and Roman times. The biblical city of Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course, Dorothy Vitaliano, her work on geomythology as well. And there's a lot of other things out there that can be examined, and it's absolutely fascinating and absolutely an amazing realm to examine, and amazing way to examine these fairy tales, these legends, these myths, and these monsters that live in our minds and imaginations. Nothing exists in a vacuum. Nothing is created in a vacuum. It has to have some influence. Something has to have been found, discovered, interacted with something to have the human imagination grow. So, anyway, thank you so much for joining me this week. Sorry about last week. Didn't kind of feel like recording. Hey, it happens, whatevers. So please, if you liked the video, please leave a like, leave a comment. I love reading the comments. Please subscribe. YouTube's been kind of they've changed their algorithm again. I have no fucking clue what's going on. I kind of don't care in that way, but please subscribe. It makes me feel good. Ring that bell so you know when a new video is coming up. And also to know when we go live for live streams. I kind of need to do another live stream at some point. Just something to do, some fun to have, something like that. I'm still not sure how the hell to get my, it's probably my computer, my Wi-Fi, all of this stuff. The chat keeps breaking, but whatever. So anyway, thank you all again for coming and listening to me rant for, 30 minutes or whatever. And I will see you all next week. Please remember to stay safe, stay smart, and I love you all. And remember, first of all, and most important of all, to keep on digging. Bye-bye, everybody.